Do you know what is happening right now? While you're watching this video, there is a tectonic shift in global power underway, one that U.S. corporate media does not want you to fully understand. Mexico, China, Brazil, and Colombia are building something Washington never imagined, an economic alignment that could redefine hemispheric trade without needing the U.S. dollar as the middleman. We're not talking about conspiracy theories or empty speculation. We're talking about real trade agreements, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure investments, new commercial routes that bypass the United States entirely. The Trump administration understands exactly what this means, the potential end of decades of unquestioned hegemony. When Brazil and China negotiate in yuan, when Mexico diversifies its trade partners beyond NAFTA's successor agreement, when Colombia strengthens ties with Beijing instead of depending exclusively on Washington, we are witnessing a fundamental shift in the architecture of global power. The real question isn't whether this is happening, it's why no one is explaining it clearly. Because understanding this geopolitical realignment means understanding the economic future of our own communities here in the United States. Let me explain exactly what's happening. This isn't just another international headline scrolling past your screen. This is foundational. It changes everything we thought we knew about how power works in this hemisphere. For decades, generations were taught a simple narrative. The United States is the inevitable center of trade, investment, and influence in Latin America. Countries south of the border had no real alternative but to look to Washington. They depended on the U.S. market, the U.S. dollar, and U.S.-dominated financial institutions. But that narrative is crumbling, and the speed of that collapse should surprise all of us. This emerging alignment between Mexico, China, Brazil, and Colombia isn't a formal organization with offices in Geneva or New York. It isn't a treaty signed with ceremony at the United Nations. It's something deeper, more organic, and frankly, more disruptive to traditional Washington interests. It's a convergence of economic interests creating new realities on the ground, new trade relationships that bypass structures the United States spent a century building. Over the past 2 decades, China has invested hundreds of billions of dollars in Latin America. Think about that. While the United States was focused on wars in the Middle East, domestic financial crises, and internal political paralysis, China was looking ahead and looking toward Latin America. While Washington was distracted, China was building ports in Brazil, financing dams in Ecuador, paving highways in Bolivia, constructing real infrastructure that connects economies and facilitates trade. These weren't speeches, they weren't promises, they were tangible projects that expanded productive capacity. And importantly, China didn't care whether a government was left-wing or right-wing. It wasn't about ideology. It was about trade, access to resources, and building long-term economic relationships that benefited both sides. For many Latin American countries tired of political conditions and external pressure, that was enormously attractive. Here's where it becomes truly significant. Brazil, the largest economy in Latin America, has been negotiating with China to conduct bilateral trade in their own currencies. Forget the dollar. When Brazil sells soybeans to China, when China sells machinery to Brazil, increasingly those transactions are settled in Brazilian reais and Chinese yuan. Some might think that's a technical detail only economists care about, but it's revolutionary. Since the end of World War II, the U.S. dollar has been the world's reserve currency. That gave the United States extraordinary economic power. Most countries needed dollars to trade. They needed U.S. banks. They needed access to a financial system influenced by Washington. But when Brazil and China trade directly in their own currencies, they're sending a clear message. We don't need the dollar. We don't need U.S. banks. We don't need Washington's permission to do business with each other. If Brazil can do it, what stops Mexico? What stops Colombia? What stops Argentina, Chile, or Peru? The answer, nothing. And it's already beginning. Modern economies understand that depending on a single partner is risky. Mexico, despite its deep integration with the United States through the USMCA, has been diversifying, not to break with America, but because serious countries don't put all their eggs in one basket. Colombia, historically one of Washington's closest allies in South America, is also recalibrating. The global trade system is no longer unipolar, it's multipolar, and China is now the largest trading partner for much of the world, not through coercion, but by offering markets, investment, and infrastructure many countries urgently need. Now let's talk about why Trump is concerned. This isn't abstract economic anxiety. It goes to the heart of how the United States has exercised power for nearly a century. U.S. influence in Latin America has never been based solely on diplomacy or shared values. It has been based on economic dependence. When a country depends on you economically, you hold leverage. But what happens when alternatives become viable? When Mexico can sell more goods to China, when Colombia can secure financing from Beijing, when Brazil can fund infrastructure through Chinese development banks rather than solely relying on the World Bank or the IMF. Dependence declines, and when dependence declines, Washington's leverage declines with it. We're seeing it in real time. Years ago, when the U.S. asked Latin American countries to follow certain policies, sanctions, diplomatic alignments, many complied because they had few alternatives. Now, options exist. Governments can say, "We value our relationship with Washington, but we also have ties elsewhere. We will decide based on our national interests." That shift, that autonomy, is what worries parts of the U.S. political establishment. And here's the deeper point. This transformation isn't ideological, it's market logic. China is now an economic superpower offering opportunities that didn't exist 20 years ago. Brazil trades with China because China buys enormous quantities of soy, iron ore, and meat. Mexico diversifies because smart countries diversify. So why is U.S. influence declining in its own hemisphere? Not because China has superior military power. The United States remains the dominant military force globally. Not because China has more attractive cultural values. The answer is simpler. China is investing in ways the United States often is not. China finances infrastructure Western banks consider too risky. It purchases commodities at scale. It offers loans without attaching the same political conditions. This isn't charity, it's geopolitics. But from a Latin American perspective, the question is practical. Who offers better development opportunities? Increasingly, the answer isn't automatically the United States. For Latino communities in the U.S., this matters. Many of us have family in Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, and across Latin America. When those countries grow economically and gain autonomy, that can mean better jobs, more opportunity, and less pressure to migrate. But from the perspective of certain interests in Washington, especially under Trump, this represents a loss of control. And Trump's response has often been tariffs, threats, and aggressive rhetoric rather than deeper investment or partnership. During his first administration, he repeatedly threatened Mexico with devastating tariffs over immigration disputes. That approach accelerated exactly what it aimed to prevent: the search for alternatives. You cannot sustain 21st-century relationships based solely on threats and dependency. The world has changed. China offers trade and investment without political lectures. For many governments, that's appealing, not because they idolize Beijing, but because they are tired of asymmetrical relationships. Mexico, despite its deep integration with the United States, is recalibrating. Colombia is exploring broader partnerships. Brazil is betting on a multipolar century with multiple centers of power. So what does this mean for us? It means the world where the United States was the unquestioned center of everything is fading. We can respond with fear, nationalism, and higher walls, or we can respond intelligently, recognizing that a multipolar world can create opportunity if managed wisely. The real question isn't how to stop this transformation, it's how the United States adapts to it in a way that benefits everyone. That means competing by offering better partnerships, investing meaningfully in Latin America, treating countries as equals, not subordinates, building relationships based on mutual benefit rather than dependence. But that would require a fundamental shift in how Washington thinks about the region, and so far there's little evidence of that shift. Each time the U.S. defaults to pressure instead of partnership, it pushes these countries closer to China. Not because China is stealing influence, but because it is competing for it. This emerging alignment between Mexico, China, Brazil, and Colombia may only be the beginning. It signals a broader reordering of global power that will define the 21st century. Latin American countries are demanding options, dignity, and autonomy. When Washington doesn't provide that, they look elsewhere. For Spanish-speaking communities in the U.S., we are uniquely positioned. We understand both worlds. We can challenge simplistic narratives. We can push for smarter, more respectful policies. We can recognize that a multipolar world is not automatically a threat. It can be an opportunity. But first, we must understand what is truly happening. Power is redistributing. The world is changing. Resisting that change blindly only guarantees decline. This is the moment to pay attention, to think critically, and to decide what role we want to play in the future that is already taking shape.